I stared at the envelope, its thick, luxurious cardstock gleaming under the warm glow of my desk lamp. The golden embossed letters spelled out what I already knew was coming: an invitation to celebrate my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. My fingers traced the edges, feeling the weight of obligation pressing down on me. I didn't even have to open it. I could already imagine the contents: a formal request for my presence, an elegant dinner, an expectation to stand in front of everyone and deliver yet another speech about the unbreakable bond of Lorraine and Martin Whitmore. The golden couple, the pillars of strength, the kind of love that withstood time, the kind of love that always overshadowed me. I flipped the envelope over, my name written in sweeping cursive, the ink precise, elegant, impersonal. There was no "Dear Nathan," no son, not even a hint of warmth. Just my name, written like an afterthought. A sharp sigh escaped me as I finally peeled it open, confirming what I already knew. The event was on March 14th. My birthday. Not that anyone would remember. I checked my phone, almost laughing at the predictable silence. No texts, no missed calls, no flood of well wishes. The last time someone had acknowledged my birthday on time, Riley had been 8 years old, proudly presenting me with a hand-drawn card covered in glitter and messy crayon hearts. That was 14 years ago. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle in my chest. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Every few years, my birthday was conveniently forgotten, overshadowed by some family event, some urgent crisis, some excuse. I had long since mastered the art of pretending not to care, but today, it gnawed at me. Maybe because 48 felt different. Maybe because I was finally too tired to keep pretending. The front door slammed shut. Footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor, growing louder as they approached. Then came Riley's voice, breathless and guilt-ridden. "Dad." I turned my chair just in time to see my daughter standing in the doorway, her blonde hair disheveled, her wide eyes filled with remorse. She was still in her cafe uniform, the scent of roasted coffee clinging to her clothes. "Hey, kid," I said, forcing a smile. Riley groaned, running a hand down her face. "Dad, I'm such an idiot. I totally forgot. I got so wrapped up in work and school, and..." She exhaled sharply, stepping closer. "I'm so sorry. Happy birthday." She dropped onto the couch across from my desk, watching me carefully, as if gauging the damage. I waved a dismissive hand. "It's fine, really. It's just another day." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not just another day. It's your day." I shrugged, but the weight in my chest only grew. "Apparently, it's also your grandparents' anniversary." Riley's eyes darkened. "Are you serious?" I slid the invitation across the desk. She snatched it up, scanning the elegant script, her expression shifting from disbelief to irritation. "On your birthday?" I gave a humorless chuckle. "It's not the first time." She let out a quiet curse under her breath, shaking her head. "And let me guess. No one called. No one texted." I didn't need to answer. She already knew. Riley flopped back against the couch, her arms crossed over her chest. "This is so messed up." I watched her, something tightening in my throat. It was strange, seeing my daughter so outraged on my behalf when I had spent decades swallowing this reality. I had long since accepted my place in this family, a fixture in the background, a convenient narrator for everyone else's story. "It's fine," I repeated, though even I didn't believe it. Riley sat up straighter, her expression determined. "No, it's not. You do so much for them. Every time they need someone to give a speech, or help plan, or be the perfect son, you show up. And they don't even bother remembering your birthday?" I rubbed a hand over my face, exhaustion creeping in. "Riley." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You always do this, Dad. You downplay it. You pretend it doesn't matter. But it does. It should." Something inside me twisted at her words, at the frustration in her voice. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something raw. It was the kind of disappointment that came from loving someone and hating the way they were treated. I exhaled slowly. "What am I supposed to do, kid? Throw a tantrum? Demand they remember?" Riley's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "No, but you don't have to keep letting them do this to you." I glanced at the invitation still clutched in her hands. "So what? I just don't go." "Why not?" she challenged. "Why should you go to a party where you're just an accessory to their perfect image? They don't see you, Dad. Not really. And if they can't even remember something as simple as your birthday, why should you keep showing up for them?" Something cracked inside me at her words, something I had been holding together for years. I had spent my entire life being the good son, the dutiful brother, the reliable voice of reason. But I was tired. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of being forgotten. Tired of pretending it didn't matter. I stared at the invitation, my pulse thrumming. The answer should have been easy. Show up, smile, give the speech, and fade into the background like I always did. That was the expected script. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to play the role anymore. Riley leaned forward, her voice softer now. Just think about it, okay? I met her gaze, seeing the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. She wasn't just my daughter. She was my only ally in this. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel completely invisible. I nodded slowly. I will. Riley exhaled in relief, standing up. Good. She glanced toward the kitchen. And since I forgot, I'm making it up to you. Whatever you want for dinner. And yes, I know my cooking is questionable, but you're not allowed to say no. A small, genuine smile tugged at my lips. Deal. She grinned, already heading for the kitchen, muttering something about finding the takeout menus just in case. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the invitation. Then, slowly, I reached for it, tearing it in half. For the first time in my life, I was done being invisible. The phone rang for the fourth time that morning, vibrating insistently on my desk. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I already knew. I let it go to voicemail. Then came another chime, this time a text. I hesitated, then glanced at the screen. Stephanie, Nathan, call Lorraine back. She's worried you're upset about something. I scoffed under my breath. Upset about something. As if my silence was the problem, not the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and expected to perform on cue like a well-trained pet. The phone buzzed again, another call. Lorraine Whitmore. I stared at it, my mother's name flashing across the screen, demanding my attention as she always did. When I was a child, that name had held power, a weight that dictated my every action. Now, it only filled me with exhaustion. It stopped ringing. A moment later, my voicemail chimed. I hesitated but pressed play. Nathan, it's your mother. I don't know why you're ignoring my calls, but we need to discuss the anniversary party. I assume you received the invitation? Call me back as soon as possible. We have a lot to plan, and I expect you to be involved. Not a single mention of my birthday. Not even a forced, last-minute acknowledgement. I deleted the message. Another text followed, this time from Caleb. Caleb, Nathan, we need to talk. Don't make this difficult. My jaw tightened. Don't make this difficult. That was always the refrain, wasn't it? Not we're sorry, not we should have called, not happy birthday. Just orders, commands, expectations. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to type something scathing. Instead, I put the phone down. From across the living room, Riley watched me, arms crossed. You're not going to answer them? I shook my head. Nope. Her lips twitched in something like approval. Good. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I don't know why I keep expecting it to change. Riley sat on the arm of the couch, shaking her head. Because you're a decent person who still, deep down, wants them to care. I ran a hand over my face. She was right, of course. No matter how much I told myself I didn't care, a part of me always did. A part of me still wanted to be seen, to be valued for something other than my ability to deliver well-crafted speeches about my parents' picture-perfect marriage. But that wasn't who they were. And it wasn't who I wanted to be anymore. I don't think I can do it this time, kid, I admitted quietly. I don't think I can go and pretend it doesn't bother me. Riley nodded. Then don't. I let out a hollow laugh. Easier said than done. You know what'll happen if I refuse. Yeah. Riley's expression darkened. They'll guilt trip you, call you selfish, act like you're ruining everything. Exactly. That was the cycle. The moment I deviated from the role they had written for me, I became the problem. I tapped my fingers against the desk. You know the last time they almost remembered my birthday? Riley tilted her head. When I exhaled sharply, the memory surfacing despite years of trying to bury it. My 30th. We were at a family dinner. Julia actually mentioned it, said something like, hey, isn't today? I paused, jaw clenching. Riley leaned forward. What happened? I let out a slow, bitter laugh. Mom shut it down before she could finish. Just cut her off mid-sentence and started talking about the anniversary party plans instead. And that was it. The moment passed, and no one said another word. Riley's hands curled into fists. That's disgusting. I shrugged. That's my family. The phone rang again. This time, it was Julia. I ignored it. Another text from Stephanie. Stephanie, Nathan, this is childish. The family needs you to step up. Call Lorraine. I scoffed. And there it is. The step-up speech. Riley groaned. I swear, it's like they have a playbook for this. I stood, pacing the room, the frustration coiling tight in my chest. The calls, the messages, the way they expected me to fold without question, it was suffocating. And for what? So I could stand in a banquet hall, raise a glass, and pretend I hadn't spent another year being erased? I wasn't doing it. Not this time. I stopped pacing, turning to face Riley. You said something yesterday. About doing something for myself for once. She nodded. Yeah. I met her gaze, my decision solidifying. Then that's exactly what I'm going to do. For years, I had played my part, let them mold me into the dutiful son, the reliable brother, the unseen, unacknowledged presence. But I was done. I was done being invisible. And for the first time, I wasn't going to let them write the script. My phone vibrated again, another desperate attempt to pull me back into their orbit. I reached for it. Then, with a flick of my thumb, I powered it off. Riley's eyes widened. Holy shit. You actually turned it off. A slow, genuine smile crept across my face. Yeah. She grinned. Damn right. I sat back down, feeling a weight lift from my chest. Tomorrow, the calls would come again. The guilt tripping, the manipulation, the endless attempts to make me feel like the villain. But for today I was free. The next morning, I awoke to an unsettling silence. It wasn't the absence of sound that felt off. It was the absence of pressure. For the first time in years, I hadn't woken up with the usual weight of obligation pressing down on me. No urgent calls to return. No speeches to draft. No performance to rehearse. And yet, the anxiety still lingered, buried deep in my bones, waiting for me to fall back into old patterns. I stretched my arms, glancing at my phone on the nightstand. It was still powered off, a choice I had made, and, for now, one I intended to keep. As I stepped into my home office, my eyes immediately landed on the unfamiliar object sitting on my desk, a leather-bound photo album. I frowned. It hadn't been there last night. Riley, I sighed, running a hand through my hair as I approached it. She must have found it buried in some forgotten box and left it here as a not-so-subtle reminder of our beloved family legacy. Still, something about it made my chest tighten. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the cover before finally flipping it open. The first page was predictable. My parents, young and glowing, staring at each other with the kind of adoration reserved for fairy tales. Below that, an old newspaper clipping about my father's law firm. A framed wedding announcement. I turned the page. Caleb's birth. My parents beaming, my older brother swaddled in my mother's arms. The golden child, their firstborn, the heir to the Whitmore name. Another page. Julia as a baby, delicate and perfect, their cherished daughter. Then more pages. More birthdays. More family gatherings. More celebrations. I flipped faster now, my stomach twisting. Caleb and Julia at the lake house. Caleb winning his first debate tournament. Julia's high school graduation. My parents' anniversary parties through the years. Where was I? I slowed, scanning the photos more carefully. My own childhood was reduced to the occasional background appearance. Half visible behind a Christmas tree, standing at the edge of a group photo, barely in focus. I swallowed hard. It wasn't that I wasn't there. It was that I was never meant to be seen. Even in the images where I was present, I was just an afterthought. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep turning the pages. Then I found it. One of the few photos where I was actually centered in the frame. It was my 12th birthday. I sat at the table, a small cake in front of me, candles flickering. But my eyes weren't on the cake. They were looking off camera, at something, or someone else. And then I saw it. My mother, standing near the counter, talking to someone on the phone, completely disinterested. Caleb and Julia, already focused on something else. Even in this moment, my moment, I had been invisible. I slammed the album shut. The anger came slow, simmering beneath my skin, tightening in my chest like a coiled spring. I had told myself for years that it didn't matter, that I had grown past it, that I was fine. I wasn't. The phone rang again. I stared at it, then, against my better judgment, turned it back on. Immediately, messages flooded in. Lorraine, Nathan, I've been trying to reach you. We need to go over the itinerary for the party. Caleb, you're acting ridiculous. Call Mom. Julia. Nathan, whatever this is, just stop. Let's talk. Then, finally, an incoming call. Mom. I exhaled slowly, debating whether to answer. I could ignore it. Let her stew in frustration. But I didn't. I pressed accept, bringing the phone to my ear. Hello. Nathan. My mother's voice was crisp, controlled. I was beginning to think something was wrong. I said nothing. A pause. Then, you received the invitation, didn't you? I did. Another silence, a beat too long. Then why haven't you called? Because you didn't call me first. Because I spent another birthday being forgotten. Because I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt. I swallowed down the words. I've been busy. I understand, she said smoothly, as if she didn't believe a word of it. But we need to discuss the details. Have you started preparing your speech? I exhaled sharply. I'm not giving a speech. A pause. Excuse me. I said I'm not giving a speech. Her voice sharpened. Nathan, this isn't the time for childish games. It's not a game, I said evenly. I'm just done playing along. She sighed, the exasperation evident. Nathan, let's be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I interrupted. I've spent my entire life being reasonable. I've given every speech, smiled through every event, played the perfect son whenever it was convenient for you. But I'm done. The silence stretched. Finally, her voice softened, too carefully, too deliberately. Nathan, this is your father and me. Our anniversary. Do you really want to ruin that? A familiar weight settled in my chest. The guilt, the manipulation, the subtle, quiet reminder that I was the one being selfish. Not them. Never them. I closed my eyes. I'm not ruining anything. I'm just choosing not to participate. Her voice hardened. You're making a mistake. No, I said quietly. I think, for the first time, I'm not. Another silence. This one stretched longer than the others. Then she sighed, exasperated. Fine. If you want to be difficult, so be it. But don't expect me to fix whatever damage you're doing to this family. I let out a bitter chuckle. I wouldn't dream of it. She hung up without another word. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had expected anger, screaming, accusations. But the coldness? The quiet dismissal? That cut deeper. I turned, finding Riley standing in the hallway. I hadn't even noticed her there. You heard that? I asked. She nodded. I waited for her to say something, but she didn't. She just walked over and sat down on the couch, pulling the photo album onto her lap. Slowly, she flipped through the pages. Her fingers traced over the pictures, Caleb's milestones, Julia's shining moments. Then she stopped on the photo of me, 12 years old, sitting alone with my birthday cake. She swallowed hard. They don't deserve you. My throat tightened. For a long time, I had told myself that family was family, that obligations had to be met, that love, no matter how conditional, was still love. But looking at Riley now, watching the way she saw the truth so clearly, it made me wonder. Maybe love was supposed to feel like this. Like someone noticing when you weren't there. Like someone standing beside you even when it was easier to stay silent. I sat beside her, staring down at the photo. For the first time, I really saw it. And I wasn't invisible anymore. The knock on my door was sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that wasn't asking for permission, it was demanding entry. I didn't need to check the peephole to know who it was. Stephanie. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders as I opened the door. She stood there, arms crossed, dressed in her usual polished efficiency, heels clicking against my front porch, hair pulled back in a severe bun, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Nathan, she said, without preamble. Stephanie. I replied evenly, stepping aside. Come in. She swept past me without hesitation, moving like someone who already considered themselves in control of the situation. That was always her way, efficient, decisive, the perfect Whitmore in-law. She had been married to Caleb for over 20 years, and in that time, she had become just as much of a fixture in the family as the rest of them. She stopped in the center of my living room, turning to face me with that perfectly practiced expression of concern. Lorraine is worried. Of course she is. I shut the door behind me. Stephanie sighed, tilting her head in a way that was meant to seem sympathetic, but I knew better. Nathan, you know how much this anniversary means to them. Your mother is already dealing with so much stress planning the event, and now, on top of everything, you're... She hesitated, searching for the right word. Being difficult? I supplied. Her lips twitched. I was going to say causing unnecessary tension. I let out a humorless chuckle, crossing my arms. Right? Because me choosing not to give a speech is what's causing tension. Not the years of neglect. Not the fact that I've been treated like an afterthought my entire life. Just me, finally saying no. Stephanie's expression didn't falter. Nathan, come on. You know that's not true. I arched a brow. Do I? She sighed again, exasperated now. You're part of this family. You always have been. Lorraine and Martin have never treated me like I mattered. I finished for her. You know it, Stephanie. You've seen it. Her lips pressed tighter. I remember the pneumonia year. I continued, my voice quieter now. When I was sick as hell, barely able to breathe, and they still made me go up there and give a speech because it would have been embarrassing if I didn't. Stephanie flinched. Just slightly. You were there, I reminded her. You watched me nearly collapse in front of 100 people, and what did my mother do? She told me to drink some water and push through it. She didn't deny it. Couldn't. I shook my head. And you're standing here, asking me to do it again? Asking me to smile, say pretty words, and pretend like everything is fine. Nathan, it's not about pretending, Stephanie said, quieter now, more careful. It's about family. About showing up. I let out a slow breath. Stephanie, when has my family ever showed up for me? Silence. That was all the answer I needed. Stephanie's gaze flickered to the coffee table where my manuscript sat. My memoir, the book I had been working on for years. The title was bold and deliberate, written in crisp black ink. The Art of Invisibility, a son's guide to being forgotten. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. You're really going through with this? I nodded. I am. Her jaw tightened. Nathan, you know what this will do to them. I met her gaze. Good. She inhaled sharply, as if trying to steady herself. This book, this statement you're making, it's going to destroy them. I tilted my head. Or maybe it's just going to expose the truth. She shook her head, pressing her fingers to her temples. Do you really think putting all of this out there for the world to see is the answer? Do you think this is going to make them love you more? I blinked, taken aback for the first time. That's not what this is about, isn't it? Stephanie challenged, stepping closer. Nathan, whether you admit it or not, you still want their approval. You want them to regret the way they've treated you. But this book, this public call-out, it's not going to get you what you want. It's only going to make things worse. I held her gaze, my chest tightening. Was there a part of me that wanted them to feel regret? To finally see me? Maybe. But I wasn't naive. I knew that this book wouldn't suddenly turn my mother into the warm, affectionate parent I had always wanted. I knew it wouldn't make Caleb or Julia suddenly value me as their equal. But it would be the truth. And for once in my life, that was enough. I exhaled slowly. Stephanie, I don't need their approval. Not anymore. What I need is to stop lying to myself. To stop pretending like their neglect didn't shape me. This book isn't revenge. It's my story. She was quiet for a long time, her gaze scanning my face, searching for something. Some weakness, some crack in my resolve. When she found none, she let out a slow breath. They won't forgive you for this. I'm not asking for forgiveness. She studied me, her lips parting slightly as if to argue. But then, something in her expression shifted. Acceptance. Or maybe just resignation. She turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. I hope you're ready for what comes next, Nathan. Because once this book is out, there's no going back. I nodded. I know. She left without another word. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, my heart still hammering in my chest. I knew what came next. The backlash. The anger. The fallout. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. I walked back to the coffee table, picking up my manuscript, running my fingers over the cover. No more speeches. No more pretending. This time, they were going to hear me, whether they wanted to or not. I was still staring at the closed door long after Stephanie had left. The room was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Her words echoed in my head, the weight of them pressing down on me. I hope you're ready for what comes next, Nathan. Because once this book is out, there's no going back. I knew she was right. I knew that publishing my memoir wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war. And yet, as I ran my fingers over the manuscript's cover, I felt no hesitation. Only certainty. A chime from my laptop pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see a new email notification flashing on the screen. Subject: Publishing contract, confirmation. I clicked it open, my pulse quickening as I scanned the words. Dear Nathan, we're pleased to confirm that your manuscript, The Art of Invisibility, A Son's Guide to Being Forgotten, has been officially approved for publication. We are on track for the scheduled release date, which, as discussed, aligns with your parents' anniversary week. We believe this timing will maximize media engagement and public interest in your story. Congratulations on what we anticipate to be a major release. Best, Emma Langley, Senior Editor, Harper and Roth Publishing. I exhaled slowly, the finality of it sinking in. This was happening. This wasn't some idle threat, some vague rebellion. The book was real. In a matter of weeks, the world would read it. My family's perfect image, the one they had spent decades curating, would finally be cracked open for everyone to see. And there wasn't a damn thing they could do to stop it. The sound of a car door slamming outside pulled my attention to the window. I frowned, stepping closer and peering through the blinds. A sleek black car sat in my driveway, and standing next to it, dressed in a tailored blazer and holding an expensive handbag, was Julia. I clenched my jaw. Of course, I had been expecting her. Julia was the golden child, the one who had always done everything right. Unlike Caleb, who had at least acknowledged my existence with occasional indifference, Julia had mastered the art of pretending my struggles didn't exist at all. Now she was here, and I already knew why. I opened the door before she could knock. Nathan, she said smoothly, as if this was a social visit. Julia. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Let me guess. Mom sent you. She offered a tight smile. Does it matter? I let out a dry laugh, stepping aside. Come in. Let's get this over with. She walked inside, taking in the space as if she had never really seen it before. Which, to be fair, she hadn't. Julia had only been to my house a handful of times, always for short visits, always with the air of someone who had more important places to be. She made her way to the living room, spotting the manuscript on the coffee table. Her eyes lingered on it for a fraction of a second before she turned to me. So, this is real, she said, more to herself than to me. I sat down on the arm of the couch. Yeah, it is. She exhaled slowly. Nathan, I don't want to fight with you. Good. Then don't. She gave me a sharp look. Come on. You know why I'm here. I shrugged. To convince me to fall back in line? To remind me that I'm overreacting? To tell me I'm making a mistake? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the coffee table, picking up the manuscript and flipping through the pages. I read a few excerpts, she admitted. Stephanie sent me some. I arched a brow. Stephanie got an advance copy? Julia's lips twitched. Nathan, she's been married to Caleb for 20 years. She has more influence in this family than you do. I huffed out a humorless laugh. Yeah, I figured. She turned another page. This isn't just a memoir. No, I said quietly. It's the truth. She glanced up at me. Your truth. I met her gaze, my patience wearing thin. Julia, don't start with that. You know damn well this isn't just my truth. You were there. You saw how they treated me. Hell, you were part of it. She flinched, just slightly, but quickly schooled her expression back into its usual composure. I never meant to hurt you, Nathan, she said. None of us did. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. That's the problem, Julia. None of you ever mean to. But you do. Over and over again. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she set the manuscript down and crossed her arms. You really think this book is going to fix anything? No, I admitted. But I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm just done pretending. Julia inhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. You know how this is going to go, don't you? Mom is going to deny everything. Caleb will try to spin it as you being too sensitive. Dad will stay quiet. The family will close ranks, and you'll be the villain. I nodded. Yeah, I know. Her eyes softened, just a little. Then why do it? I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. Because I spent my whole life waiting for them to see me. And I finally realized they never will. So I have to see myself. She looked away, something flickering across her face. Guilt, maybe, or something close to it. A long silence stretched between us. Then she sighed. I got a call from a journalist this morning. They want to do an interview. A family interview. I raised a brow. And she hesitated, then looked me in the eye. I told them I wasn't ready to comment. Something inside me shifted. Not an apology. Not an admission of guilt. But it was a start. I nodded. Thanks. She exhaled, rubbing her forehead. I don't know how this ends, Nathan, but I do know that after this book comes out, things will never be the same. I gave her a small, tired smile. Good. She stared at me for another long moment before finally turning toward the door. For what it's worth, she said over her shoulder, I really do hope this gives you what you're looking for. I didn't answer, because for the first time, I wasn't looking for their validation. I had already found something better. The restaurant was dimly lit, all dark wood and soft golden chandeliers, the kind of place that made it clear you were meant to feel important just by sitting there. I'd been here before, countless times actually. Family dinners, anniversary gatherings, the occasional holiday celebration. It was the Whitmore standard, exclusive, elegant, and carefully curated to maintain appearances. Tonight was no different. Except it was. This wasn't a casual dinner. It was an intervention disguised as a pre-anniversary gathering. And I knew exactly how it would go. I adjusted my jacket, rolling my shoulders as I entered. The hostess recognized me immediately, offering a tight smile before gesturing toward the private dining room in the back. I didn't need directions. I already knew where to find them. The moment I stepped inside, all conversation halted. The long, polished table was set with fine china and gleaming silverware, wine glasses half filled, the air thick with the scent of expensive steak and unspoken expectations. My mother sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully composed, a porcelain mask of quiet authority. My father, as always, was beside her, silent and watchful. Julia was already seated, her hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes wary. Caleb leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, exuding the kind of casual indifference he always did when he wanted to seem unaffected. Stephanie, ever the peacemaker, was the first to speak. Nathan, glad you could make it. I pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. Well, I figured if I didn't show up, someone would just show up at my door again. A flicker of irritation crossed my mother's face before she smoothed it away. Caleb sighed, shaking his head. Jesus, Nathan, can you stop acting like a victim for one night? There it was. The opening shot. I gave him a slow, humorless smile. You invited me here to sort things out, didn't you? I'm just setting the tone. Julia cleared her throat, her voice clipped. Look, we all know why we're here. She turned toward me, her gaze steady. Mom and Dad want to understand why you're doing this. Why you're pushing the family away. I let out a sharp laugh. I'm pushing them away? I gestured around the table. That's rich. Stephanie leaned forward, her voice smooth and diplomatic. Nathan, no one is saying your feelings aren't valid. That's exactly what you're saying, I interrupted. That's what you've always said. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. Every time I bring up how I've been treated, how I've been ignored, you all act like I'm overreacting. But let's be honest, none of you have ever seen me as an equal. I've spent my entire life proving myself to a family that barely acknowledges my existence. Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. Nathan, that's not fair. I arched a brow. Isn't it? Let's do a little test. I leaned back, folding my arms. Caleb, what's my favorite book? He blinked, caught off guard. I turned to Julia. What was the name of my first published novel? She shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable. Finally, I met my mother's gaze. Mom, what day is my birthday? A tense silence fell over the table. My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Nathan, I don't see what. Just say it. I said, my voice quiet now. Say the date. She didn't. The silence stretched. Riley, who had been sitting quietly beside me, suddenly let out a harsh laugh. Wow. Just wow. My mother's eyes snapped to her. Riley, sweetheart, this is a family discussion. Oh, I know, Riley shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm just enjoying watching you all prove my dad's point in real time. She shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. You don't even know his birthday. And you have the audacity to sit here and act like he's the one pushing you away. Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. Nathan, we're not trying to dismiss you. We just don't want the truth to come out. I finished for her. Caleb groaned, slamming his glass down. For God's sake, Nathan, this book, it's going to ruin everything. Do you get that? Mom and Dad have spent their entire lives building this family's reputation, and now you're throwing it away just to what? Make a statement. I let out a slow breath. You still don't get it. I reached into my bag, pulling out several crisp copies of my manuscript and sliding them across the table. Here, read it. Read every word. And then tell me I'm wrong. My mother hesitated before picking up the book, her hands trembling slightly. Julia took one, flipping through the pages with a carefully controlled expression. Caleb didn't even touch his. You really want to do this? He asked, his voice quiet now. I met his gaze. I already have. A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, my father spoke. Nathan. His voice was low, steady. We never meant to make you feel like you weren't valued. I swallowed hard. But you did. His jaw tightened. You're my son. That has always mattered to me. I let out a hollow laugh. Then why didn't you ever show it? Another silence. And then, for the first time in my life, I saw something crack in my father's expression. A flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. My mother, however, wasn't ready to break. Her voice was cold now, carefully measured. Nathan, if you go through with this, if you let this book be published, understand that you are choosing to sever ties with this family. I met her gaze, my heartbeat steady. No, Mom. I'm finally choosing myself. Riley stood up beside me. Come on, Dad. We're done here. And for the first time in my life, I walked away. Not broken, not unseen, just free. I woke up the next morning to a buzzing phone. At first, I ignored it, letting it vibrate on my nightstand as I rubbed my eyes, my body still tense from last night's dinner. But when it didn't stop, when the calls and messages came in one after another, I sighed, rolling over to grab it. I powered on the screen. 46 missed calls. Texts poured in at an almost alarming rate. Not just from my family, but from old friends, acquaintances, and people I hadn't spoken to in years. Even my publisher had left a voicemail. The first notification that caught my eye was from Riley. Riley, Dad. Check the news. My pulse quickened. I opened my email first, scrolling through the flood of messages before landing on the one from my publisher. Emma Langley, Harper and Roth Publishing. Subject, urgent, the book is blowing up. Nathan, I hope you're ready for what's coming. The first early reviews dropped late last night, and the media picked up the story faster than we anticipated. We knew your book would resonate, but this is something else. Every major outlet is talking about it. People are calling it raw, unflinching, and a masterpiece of family dysfunction. We need to talk ASAP. Interviews are being requested. This is bigger than we thought. Call me. Best. Emma. I sucked in a breath, sitting up. This was happening. I quickly pulled up a news site, my stomach twisting as I skimmed the headlines. The Art of Invisibility. A son's unforgiving memoir exposes the hidden scars of a perfect family. Nathan Whitmore's explosive book forces a conversation about neglect within wealthy families. Best-selling author reveals the pain of being the forgotten child, and it's gut-wrenching. My throat tightened. I clicked on the first article, skimming the opening paragraphs. They quoted passages from my book, analyzing my words, dissecting my family dynamics in ways I had spent my entire life pretending weren't real. They weren't just talking about me. They were talking about them. The Whitmores. The picture-perfect legacy my parents had cultivated for 50 years. The high society image they had carefully built. And it was unraveling. My phone rang again. This time, my publisher's name flashing across the screen. I answered, my voice hoarse. Emma. Jesus, Nathan. Her voice was breathless, full of adrenaline. Do you have any idea what's happening right now? I'm starting to. This book isn't just trending, it's exploding. Reviewers are calling it one of the most honest portrayals of family dysfunction they've ever read. The response is overwhelming. Every talk show wants you. Every news outlet is covering it. She hesitated. And your family? They're getting calls too. I exhaled slowly. I figured. She paused, then asked the question I had been bracing for. Have you spoken to them? I closed my eyes briefly. Not yet. They're not going to be happy. I let out a dry laugh. When are they ever? Emma sighed. Look, Nathan. I need you to be prepared. Your book isn't just being read, it's resonating. People are sharing their own stories, connecting with your experiences. But that means the scrutiny is only going to get worse. Your family might try to discredit you. They might try to spin the narrative. They always do. Then be ready. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I will be. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, gripping my phone. Then, as if on cue, another call came through. Mom. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. but I already knew she wouldn't stop. I answered. The silence on the other end was thick, simmering with restrained fury. Then, finally, my mother's voice, clipped and cold. What have you done? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady. I told the truth. You humiliated us. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut like a knife. Your father, your family, we are being dragged through the mud because of you. I closed my eyes briefly, pressing my fingers to my temple. No, you're being dragged through the mud because of how you treated me. Because it was real. You are ungrateful. There it was. The familiar accusation. I exhaled. Mom. No, her voice sharpened. You listen to me. You have no idea what you've done. Do you think people will see you as some kind of victim? That they'll pity you? The world will move on, but this family, you have destroyed it. I didn't destroy anything, I said, my voice steady. I just stopped hiding it. Silence. Then, in a quieter, sharper tone, this book, it will ruin us. I let that hang between us. Then, finally, I said the words I had been holding back my entire life. Then maybe it deserves to be ruined. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, without another word, she hung up. I let out a slow, shaky breath, staring at the phone in my hands. That was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment when my mother, for the first time in my life, had nothing left to say. A knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I stood up, my body still buzzing with adrenaline, and opened it. Caleb stood there. He looked different. Not furious. Not smug. Just tired. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Jesus, Nathan, you really did it. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked in slowly, his gaze scanning the living room before landing on the manuscript still sitting on my coffee table. He swallowed hard. I read it. I watched him carefully, and, for the first time, his shoulders sagged. His voice was quiet when he spoke. You weren't wrong. A lump formed in my throat. He looked at me, something raw and unfamiliar in his expression. We failed you, didn't we? I let out a slow breath. Yeah. He nodded, exhaling sharply. I don't know how to fix this. I swallowed the knot in my throat. Maybe you start by just seeing me. Another silence. Then, finally, he nodded. Okay. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a perfect resolution. But it was something. And for the first time in my life, it was enough. The anniversary party was already in full swing by the time I arrived. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate was packed with elegantly dressed guests, clinking champagne glasses, and carefully orchestrated small talk. Golden chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, reflecting off polished marble floors. A live quartet played soft classical music in the corner, the kind of background melody that made everything feel just a little more perfect. It was the same as every other anniversary party before it. Except this time, the tension was palpable. I spotted my mother near the main table, her expression composed but tight, her spine rigid as she smiled at guests. My father stood beside her, quiet as ever, a drink in his hand but his eyes distant. Caleb and Julia hovered nearby, their faces unreadable. Stephanie, ever the poised politician of the family, was engaged in a hushed conversation with one of my parents' old friends. Everyone was pretending they weren't under scrutiny, pretending their names hadn't been splashed across articles dissecting my book, pretending they weren't quietly unraveling. But I could see it, the cracks in their armor. And for once, I wasn't the one crumbling. I stepped forward, moving through the room with deliberate slowness, letting them see me, letting them feel my presence. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. That's him, the author, the one who wrote about them. I heard Lorraine refuse to comment. She must be livid. I ignored them, making my way to the front of the room where my family stood. My mother saw me first. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't look away. Julia shifted uncomfortably. Caleb exhaled sharply, his gaze flicking to me before turning to our father. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, I reached into my bag, pulling out a copy of my book. I set it down on the table in front of my mother. A few guests nearby went silent, sensing the shift in the air. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply said, "You should read it." My mother's fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass, knuckles white. "Nathan," she said, her voice carefully even, "what are you doing here?" I met her gaze. I wanted to see for myself. She tilted her head slightly, expression unreadable. "See what?" If you'd pretend none of it happened, I said softly. If you'd stand here, smiling like everything is fine, while the entire world knows it isn't. Her jaw tightened. You didn't have to come, she said, her voice sharper now. You made your choice when you published that thing. That thing is my life, I shot back. Caleb stepped forward, clearing his throat. Maybe this isn't the time. No. I interrupted, my eyes still on my mother. This is exactly the time. I reached for the book, flipping it open. My heart pounded, but I didn't stop. I turned to the dedication page and read aloud. To those who have spent a lifetime screaming into silence, your voice matters. Even when they refuse to hear it. The room went still. I looked up, meeting my mother's gaze. Something flickered in her expression. Anger, hurt, maybe even regret, but she buried it just as quickly. You came here to humiliate us, she said, her voice cold. I shook my head. No, I came here to show you that you don't control the narrative anymore. Julia shifted, arms crossed tightly. Nathan, enough. No. Riley's voice cut through the tension like a knife. My daughter stepped forward, standing beside me, her gaze unwavering. I spent years watching my dad pretend he was okay, she said. Watching him push everything down, play along, act like he didn't care that you forgot him. She turned toward my grandparents, her voice steady but fierce. Do you even realize what you did to him? What you still do to him? My mother exhaled sharply. Riley, sweetheart, this is. Don't, Riley snapped. Don't sweetheart me. You don't get to talk down to me just because I'm younger. I see things clearly. I remember his birthdays when none of you do. I see the way you expect him to just take it. How you dismiss him every single time he tries to say something real. Silence. Riley's voice softened, but the hurt in it was undeniable. He deserved better than this family. My father, who had remained silent all evening, finally spoke. I know. The words were quiet, barely audible, but they carried more weight than anything else in the room. I turned to him, stunned. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. I know, he repeated, his voice raw. I should have stepped in. I should have said something sooner. My mother stiffened beside him, her eyes flashing. Martin. But he didn't look at her. He only looked at me. I thought keeping the peace was more important than acknowledging the cracks, he admitted. I thought if I ignored it, it wouldn't matter. That it wouldn't hurt you. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. The room was silent. For the first time in my life, my father, the Martin Whitmore, was admitting that he had failed me. A slow, unsteady breath left my chest. I had spent years waiting for this moment. And now that it was here, I didn't know what to do with it. My mother's expression darkened. We are not doing this here. I met her gaze one last time. No, you aren't doing this. But I am. I turned to Riley. Let's go. She nodded, slipping her hand into mine as we walked toward the exit. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't leaving with nothing. I was leaving with my truth. And for once, that was enough. The aftermath was immediate and relentless. By the time I got home that night, my phone was a battlefield of missed calls, texts, and unread emails. My publisher had left another voicemail, her tone urgent but thrilled. The book was everywhere, on television segments, social media debates, and online forums filled with people sharing their own stories of being forgotten, dismissed, erased. And my family. They were unraveling. I sat at my kitchen table, Riley across from me, scrolling through her phone. Dad? She said, not looking up. They're panicking. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth doing nothing to settle my nerves. I figured. She turned her screen toward me. A news clip was playing, a well-known anchor discussing the art of invisibility. Nathan Whitmore's memoir is already climbing bestseller lists, striking a chord with readers who have experienced family neglect. But what does this mean for the prestigious Whitmore family? Sources say the anniversary party took a dramatic turn when Nathan confronted his parents in front of their guests. We've reached out for a statement from Lorraine and Martin Whitmore, but so far, no response. Riley smirked. They won't respond. Not yet. I exhaled slowly, setting my mug down. They're figuring out their angle first. Because that was what the Whitmores did. They strategized. They spun the narrative. And I had just destroyed theirs. My phone vibrated again. Another call. This time, from Julia. I hesitated, then answered. Hello. Her voice was tight, controlled. Well, congratulations, Nathan. You've managed to turn this into a full-blown media circus. I rubbed my temple. Julia, if you're calling to yell at me, just get it over with. She let out a sharp breath. This isn't about yelling. This is about damage control. Mom is furious. Dad, she hesitated. Dad's been quiet. I sat up a little straighter. Quiet how? I don't know, she admitted. It's different this time. He's not defending her. He's not trying to smooth things over. He's just thinking. That was new. That was unexpected. And yet, I didn't have time to process it before Julia's voice sharpened again. But Mom? She's already planning her next move. She's going to go public, Nathan. She wants to put out a statement. And if you think she won't throw you under the bus, you're kidding yourself. I let out a dry laugh. I don't doubt it. She's calling the book exaggerated, Julia continued. She's framing you as the bitter son who's making things worse than they really were. I scoffed. Of course she is. Julia hesitated, then her voice softened. Nathan, this is bad. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. I know. Another long pause. Then, for the first time, she said, I read the whole thing. I blinked, caught off guard. Julia had read my book, and the way she said it, her voice wasn't dismissive, wasn't defensive. It was quiet, almost heavy. I waited, giving her space to say more. Finally, she sighed. I thought I knew our family. I thought I understood our childhood. But your book, God, Nathan, it made me see things I didn't want to see. A lump formed in my throat. You weren't wrong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You were never wrong. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady myself. For years, I had fought to be heard. For years, I had begged my family to see me. And now, Julia, golden child, perfect daughter Julia, was finally acknowledging it. It didn't erase the past. But damn, it mattered. I swallowed hard. Thank you. She let out a breath, like she'd been holding it in. I don't know what happens next. Mom is going to fight this, Nathan. She's going to fight you. And I don't know how long Dad is going to stay on the sidelines. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I know. Another pause. Then, softer this time, she said, just don't disappear, okay? My chest tightened. For years, I had been the invisible one, the overlooked one, the one they could ignore when it was convenient. But now, Juliet didn't want me to disappear. And that meant something. I won't, I promised. After we hung up, I set my phone down, running a hand through my hair. Riley watched me, her expression unreadable. What? I asked. She tilted her head. You look different. I frowned. Different how? She smiled slightly. Lighter. I exhaled, shaking my head. I don't know about that. But deep down, I wondered if she was right. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving my family. I was changing it. The next morning, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it, expecting another reporter, another desperate attempt at damage control. But it wasn't the media. It was my father. He stood there, looking older than I remembered. Not physically. His hair was still neatly combed, his suit pressed, but tired. Weary in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with realization. I hesitated, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Dad, he nodded once. Nathan. A long silence stretched between us. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, wrapped box. He held it out to me. I frowned, hesitating before taking it. The weight was familiar, small, but solid. I glanced up at him. What is this? His jaw tightened. Your 12th birthday. I blinked. What? He exhaled, shifting slightly. I bought you a gift. That year. But things were busy. And I forgot to give it to you. I stared at the box, my fingers tightening around the paper. My 12th birthday. The year I sat alone at the table, staring at a cake no one cared about. The year I watched my mother turn away mid-sentence, shifting focus to something more important. And all this time, my father had held on to this. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Dad, I can't change what I did, he said quietly, or what I didn't do. But I don't want to pretend anymore. I met his gaze, my heart hammering. This wasn't a grand apology. This wasn't years of neglect suddenly erased. But it was real. And that was something. I exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time, I stepped aside and said, come in. And my father, Martin Whitmore, the man who had spent a lifetime looking the other way, walked through my door. Not as a stranger, not as a man bound by obligation, but as someone who, finally, wanted to see me. The aftermath was immediate and relentless. By the time I got home that night, my phone was a battlefield of missed calls, texts, and unread emails. My publisher had left another voicemail, her tone urgent but thrilled. The book was everywhere, on television segments, social media debates, and online forums filled with people sharing their own stories of being forgotten, dismissed, erased. And my family. They were unraveling. I sat at my kitchen table, Riley across from me, scrolling through her phone. "Dad?" she said, not looking up. "They're panicking." I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth doing nothing to settle my nerves. I figured. She turned her screen toward me. A news clip was playing, a well-known anchor discussing the art of invisibility. Nathan Whitmore's memoir is already climbing bestseller lists, striking a chord with readers who have experienced family neglect. But what does this mean for the prestigious Whitmore family? Sources say the anniversary party took a dramatic turn when Nathan confronted his parents in front of their guests. "We've reached out for a statement from Lorraine and Martin Whitmore, but so far, no response." Riley smirked. "They won't respond. Not yet." I exhaled slowly, setting my mug down. They're figuring out their angle first. Because that was what the Whitmores did. They strategized. They spun the narrative. And I had just destroyed theirs. My phone vibrated again. Another call. This time, from Julia. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello." Her voice was tight, controlled. "Well, congratulations, Nathan. You've managed to turn this into a full-blown media circus." I rubbed my temple. "Julia, if you're calling to yell at me, just get it over with." She let out a sharp breath. "This isn't about yelling. This is about damage control. Mom is furious." "Dad," she hesitated. "Dad's been quiet." I sat up a little straighter. "Quiet how?" "I don't know," she admitted. "It's different this time. He's not defending her. He's not trying to smooth things over. He's just thinking." That was new. That was unexpected. And yet, I didn't have time to process it before Julia's voice sharpened again. "But Mom? She's already planning her next move. She's going to go public, Nathan. She wants to put out a statement. And if you think she won't throw you under the bus, you're kidding yourself." I let out a dry laugh. "I don't doubt it. She's calling the book exaggerated," Julia continued. "She's framing you as the bitter son who's making things worse than they really were." I scoffed. "Of course she is." Julia hesitated, then her voice softened. "Nathan, this is bad." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. "I know." Another long pause. Then, for the first time, she said, "I read the whole thing." I blinked, caught off guard. Julia had read my book? And the way she said it, her voice wasn't dismissive, wasn't defensive. It was quiet, almost heavy. I waited, giving her space to say more. Finally, she sighed. "I thought I knew our family. I thought I understood our childhood. But your book, God, Nathan, it made me see things I didn't want to see." A lump formed in my throat. "You weren't wrong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were never wrong." I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady myself. For years, I had fought to be heard. For years, I had begged my family to see me. And now, Julia, golden child, perfect daughter Julia, was finally acknowledging it. It didn't erase the past. But damn, it mattered. I swallowed hard. "Thank you." She let out a breath, like she'd been holding it in. "I don't know what happens next. Mom is going to fight this, Nathan. She's going to fight you. And I don't know how long Dad is going to stay on the sidelines." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I know." Another pause. Then, softer this time, she said, "Just don't disappear, okay?" My chest tightened. For years, I had been the invisible one, the overlooked one, the one they could ignore when it was convenient. But now? Julia didn't want me to disappear, and that meant something. "I won't," I promised. After we hung up, I set my phone down, running a hand through my hair. Riley watched me, her expression unreadable. "What?" I asked. She tilted her head. "You look different." I frowned. "Different how?" She smiled slightly. "Lighter." I exhaled, shaking my head. I don't know about that. But deep down, I wondered if she was right. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving my family. I was changing it. The next morning, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it, expecting another reporter, another desperate attempt at damage control. But it wasn't the media. It was my father. He stood there, looking older than I remembered. Not physically. His hair was still neatly combed, his suit pressed, but tired. Weary in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with realization. I hesitated, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Dad." He nodded once. "Nathan." A long silence stretched between us. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, wrapped box. He held it out to me. I frowned, hesitating before taking it. The weight was familiar, small, but solid. I glanced up at him. What is this? His jaw tightened. Your 12th birthday. I blinked. What? He exhaled, shifting slightly. I bought you a gift. That year. But things were busy, and I forgot to give it to you. I stared at the box, my fingers tightening around the paper. My 12th birthday. The year I sat alone at the table, staring at a cake no one cared about. The year I watched my mother turn away mid-sentence, shifting focus to something more important. And all this time, my father had held on to this. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Dad, I can't change what I did, he said quietly, or what I didn't do. But I don't want to pretend anymore. I met his gaze, my heart hammering. This wasn't a grand apology. This wasn't years of neglect suddenly erased. But it was real. And that was something. I exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time, I stepped aside and said, "Come in." And my father, Martin Whitmore, the man who had spent a lifetime looking the other way, walked through my door. Not as a stranger, not as a man bound by obligation, but as someone who, finally, wanted to see me. The sound of boiling water filled the kitchen as I placed two mismatched mugs on the counter. My father sat at the dining table, his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the small, wrapped gift he had given me. Neither of us had spoken much since he walked through the door. It wasn't an easy silence, but it wasn't suffocating either. It was unfamiliar. I poured the tea, setting a cup in front of him before sitting across from him. He murmured a quiet thanks, stirring it absent-mindedly. I eyed the small box beside him, my fingers twitching to unwrap it. I had spent my whole life assuming my father had never thought much about me. That he had been complicit in my invisibility, not out of malice, but because it was easier. But now, looking at that gift, 12 years late, yet somehow right on time, I wasn't so sure anymore. I picked it up slowly, hesitating. You really held on to this all these years? He let out a slow breath. I did. I turned the box over in my hands before carefully peeling the faded paper away. Inside was a sleek, black case, the leather worn but well kept. I flicked it open, my breath catching. A watch. It was simple but elegant, silver casing, dark leather band, the kind of timeless design my father always gravitated toward. I swallowed hard. You picked this out for me. He nodded, shifting slightly. I thought you'd like it. You were getting older, starting to act more independent. I wanted you to have something adult, something that made you feel important. I ran my fingers over the glass face, my chest tightening. I tried to picture my father, years ago, standing in a store, carefully choosing this for me. A version of him who had seen me, if only briefly. Then I imagined him forgetting to give it to me, tucking it away, letting time swallow it whole. I exhaled slowly. Why now? He looked down at his tea, his fingers drumming against the table. Because I was wrong, Nathan. His voice was quiet but firm. I thought that keeping things smooth, keeping things quiet, was the best way to hold the family together. I thought as long as everything looked fine, it was fine. I stared at him. And now, his jaw tightened. Now, I see that silence wasn't keeping things together. It was tearing things apart. Something in my chest cracked open. I had spent years hoping for this. Some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of admission that it wasn't just me. That I wasn't crazy, or dramatic, or overreacting. That I had been invisible, and it hadn't been okay. And now here it was. My father, a man who had spent his life burying his emotions, was sitting in front of me, owning his failure. I didn't know what to do with it. I let out a slow breath, setting the watch down. Mom's never going to admit it. He sighed. I know. She's going to fight this until the end. I know. I rubbed my temples. So what happens now? He leaned back, studying me for a long moment. That's up to you, Nathan. I frowned. What do you mean? I mean, I don't expect you to forgive us overnight. He shook his head. Hell, I don't even know if we deserve it. But if you ever decide you want to try, I want to be here. My throat tightened. This wasn't a promise that things would magically be okay. But it was an opening. A small, hesitant attempt at something. I let out a slow breath. We'll see. He nodded, accepting that as the best answer I could give. The conversation shifted after that. We didn't talk about the book, or the media, or my mother's inevitable next move. We just sat, talked about small things, shared stories we hadn't before. And for the first time, I saw my father as a person, not just as the quiet, distant man who had stood by while I disappeared, but as someone who had been trapped by the same expectations that had erased me. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. Weeks passed. The book remained on bestseller lists. The media storm around my family refused to die down, but something shifted. Julia gave a rare interview, her tone hesitant but honest. She admitted that the book had made her confront things she hadn't wanted to see, that she hadn't understood how deep the cracks ran until now. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Caleb remained distant, but I saw glimpses of something new in him. The way he watched our parents more carefully now, the way he thought before he spoke. He wasn't ready to admit anything, not yet. But maybe one day he would. And my mother? True to form, she refused to acknowledge the book publicly. But one afternoon, I found a package at my door. No note, no explanation, just a calendar. I flipped through it, my breath catching when I saw what had been carefully marked inside. March 14th, Nathan's birthday. My mother would never say the words. She would never admit to what she had done. But maybe, in her own way, she was trying. Maybe that was enough. A month later, the first new family tradition began. It wasn't grand. It wasn't formal. It was just tea at my house. Julia came first, hesitant but present. Caleb followed, still stubborn, but curious. My father never missed a meeting. And my mother? She never came. Not yet. But maybe one day. I sat on my porch one evening, Riley beside me, as the sun dipped below the horizon. You did it, she murmured, sipping her tea. I huffed out a laugh. Did what? Changed things. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pride in her eyes. I thought about the years of silence, the pain, the erasure, and I thought about what I had now. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was seen, and that was everything.